There's a particular kind of pain that cuts deeper than any wound inflicted by strangers. The pain that arises from conflicts within the family. Family. The word itself conjures images of warmth, love, and belonging. Yet, ironically, it is often within this very circle that we experience our most profound struggles, the harshest words, and the heaviest silences. Why is that? Why do the people who are supposed to be closest to us sometimes become the source of our greatest frustration and sorrow? Is it because family ties are stronger and so the stakes feel higher? Or perhaps because, buried beneath every disagreement, lie unspoken expectations and old wounds? In Buddhism, these questions are not just matters of psychology or social dynamics. They are windows into the deeper workings of the mind, the roots of suffering that extend beyond individual relationships and reach into the very fabric of our existence. Family conflicts, from a Buddhist perspective, are reflections of the inner turmoil we all face. Attachment, anger, ignorance, the three poisons that cloud our vision and keep us trapped in cycles of pain. But there is hope. Buddhism offers more than just explanations. It offers a path to healing and transformation. Rather than simply trying to fix external circumstances, it invites us to look inward, to understand the patterns that fuel conflict, and to cultivate qualities that dissolve anger and open the heart. Imagine a family not torn apart by misunderstandings and bitterness, but bound together by genuine compassion and mutual respect. Picture relationships that, while not perfect, are resilient and nurturing, able to weather storms without breaking. This vision is not an idealistic fantasy, but a practical possibility grounded in timeless wisdom. Over the course of this journey, we will explore how Buddhist teachings illuminate the causes of family conflict and reveal tools for resolving it with kindness, patience, and awareness. We will hear stories that inspire, reflect on deep philosophical insights, and discover simple, powerful practices that anyone can apply in their daily lives. This is a story about more than just families. It's a story about the human heart, its capacity to wound and to heal, to close off and to open wide. And it's a story about how, through understanding and compassion, even the deepest divides can be bridged. So if you have ever felt the sting of a family quarrel, the weight of unresolved tension, or the ache of distance from those you love, you are not alone. Together, let's step onto this path of healing, where ancient wisdom meets everyday reality, and where the possibility of peace begins with a single mindful breath. When tensions rise around the family dinner table, or silence thickens the space between loved ones, it's easy to blame circumstances or the other person's behavior. But if we pause and look more deeply, Buddhism invites us to trace these conflicts back to their true origins, not in the outside world, but inside the mind. At the heart of family struggles lie what Buddhism calls the three poisons: greed, hatred, and delusion. These aren't just abstract ideas, they are the emotional forces that twist our perceptions and push us toward actions that cause harm, often to those closest to us. Greed here doesn't mean money or possessions alone. It's the craving for approval, for control, for having things our way. It's the fierce attachment to our own views, identities, and desires, especially within family dynamics where roles and expectations run deep. Hatred might seem obvious as anger or resentment, but it also hides in subtle forms: bitterness, impatience, judgment. When family members feel hurt or misunderstood, these feelings easily swell, creating walls instead of bridges. Then there's delusion, the fog of ignorance that clouds understanding. This is the tendency to see the world and our loved ones through distorted lenses, assuming intentions, holding grudges, refusing to forgive. It's a blindness that prevents us from truly seeing the other person, and even ourselves, as we really are. These poisons don't act alone, they feed on each other, creating a tangled web of suffering. What starts as a small disagreement can spiral into lasting estrangement because these hidden forces go unchecked. Buddhism teaches that family conflicts are often karmic in nature, meaning they arise from past causes and conditions, including previous actions and patterns of behavior. This doesn't mean family members are doomed to conflict forever, but it does suggest that there is a deeper, often unseen, context shaping our interactions. Recognizing these roots changes everything. Instead of simply reacting to anger or frustration, we begin to see these emotions as signals, opportunities to investigate what lies beneath. Are we clinging too tightly to our pride? Are we trapped in old stories that no longer serve us? Are we willing to let go of rigid views and open ourselves to understanding? By embracing this inner work, family conflicts become more than problems to solve. They transform into paths for spiritual growth. The struggle itself becomes a mirror, reflecting the parts of ourselves that need healing and attention. And this is where the journey truly begins, moving beyond blame and pain to uncover the hidden causes and cultivate the wisdom and compassion needed to heal. It's a path that invites patience, courage, and humility, but promises the reward of deeper connection. And when family conflicts arise, the path to resolution is rarely found by confrontation alone. Instead, Buddhism offers a set of timeless principles, like a compass guiding us through the storm of emotions, to help us navigate toward understanding and harmony. At the very foundation lies compassion, or karuna. It is the tender awareness of another's suffering, the willingness to hold space for their pain without judgment. Compassion softens the heart and breaks down barriers built by anger and resentment. It reminds us that beneath the harsh words or difficult behaviors are human beings struggling, just as we do. Closely intertwined with compassion is loving kindness, known as metta. This isn't just a warm feeling. It's an active, intentional wish for the well-being of others, even those who have hurt us. Loving kindness nurtures forgiveness and opens the door to reconciliation by replacing hostility with goodwill. Then there is patience, or khanti, often overlooked but essential. Family conflicts test our endurance, challenging us to bear frustration and hurt without lashing out. Patience gives us the strength to pause, breathe, and respond with calm instead of reacting impulsively. Another pillar is right speech, a part of the noble eightfold path that guides us to communicate with honesty, kindness, and purpose. Right speech encourages us to speak truths gently, avoid gossip or harsh words, and create dialogue that heals rather than wounds. It's the art of expressing ourselves clearly without harming others. And perhaps the most challenging of all is non-attachment, the practice of letting go of ego and fixed opinions. Family disputes often escalate because each person clings stubbornly to their own perspective, identity, or sense of rightness. Non-attachment invites us to loosen these grips, to see beyond my way or your way, and to embrace openness and flexibility. Underlying all these principles is mindfulness, the practice of being fully present with whatever arises in our hearts and minds. Mindfulness allows us to observe our emotions without becoming overwhelmed by them. It gives us the space to choose how we respond, rather than reacting out of habit or pain. Together, these teachings form a powerful toolkit. They don't promise quick fixes or perfect families, but they cultivate a way of being that transforms conflict from a battlefield into a fertile ground for growth. Imagine a conversation where, instead of defensiveness, there is curiosity, where disagreement doesn't shut down connection, but invites deeper listening. Picture a family gathering where patience and kindness guide interactions, and where misunderstandings are met with gentle awareness rather than anger. This is the heart of Buddhist wisdom applied to family life, a daily practice of turning inward, cultivating virtues, and letting them ripple outward in our relationships. It's a slow unfolding, a journey of learning and understanding the principles is one thing, but how do we bring them into the messy, everyday reality of family life? How do we transform tension and hurt into healing and connection? Buddhism offers practical tools, simple yet profound, that anyone can use to mend wounds and nurture harmony. One of the most powerful techniques is loving-kindness meditation, or metta bhavana. This practice begins with yourself, cultivating warmth and goodwill inwardly, and then gradually extends to family members, even those with whom you struggle. As you silently repeat wishes for their happiness, peace, and well-being, a subtle shift occurs. The heart softens, grudges loosen, and the mind opens to forgiveness. Meditation isn't about denying conflict or suppressing emotions. It's about creating space. Space where anger can arise without controlling us, where pain can be acknowledged without defining us. This mindful awareness helps us respond with calm rather than react with impulse. Another essential practice is deep listening, truly hearing what family members are saying beyond the words. This means setting aside judgment, resisting the urge to interrupt or defend, and tuning into the emotions and needs beneath the surface. When someone feels genuinely heard, walls come down and understanding begins. Coupled with deep listening is empathetic communication, expressing your feelings honestly but gently, using I statements instead of accusations. For example, saying, "I feel hurt when," rather than "you always." This approach reduces defensiveness and invites dialogue rather than conflict. Then there is the practice of generosity or dana. Giving time, attention, or small acts of kindness, even when tensions run high, plants seeds of goodwill. It might be as simple as helping with chores, offering a warm meal, or sending a thoughtful message. These gestures rebuild trust and remind family members of their shared humanity. Sometimes, healing requires facing our own mistakes through confession and repentance. Buddhism encourages sincere acknowledgement of wrongdoings and the intention to change. This practice cleanses guilt and opens the door to reconciliation, freeing both parties from the burden of unresolved resentment. It's important to remember these practices aren't magic spells that erase conflict instantly. They are disciplines, habits to cultivate daily, often in small moments. Over time, they reshape the atmosphere of family life, making space for patience, kindness, and renewed connection. Imagine a home where each person feels seen and valued, where tensions don't explode but are met with calm understanding. Picture family members who, despite differences, commit to listening deeply and acting with compassion. These techniques are the bridge between Buddhist philosophy and lived experience. They invite us to become active participants in healing, rather than passive victims of conflict. Healing family relationships is sometimes the deepest lessons are not taught through arguments or explanations, but through stories, tales that touch the heart and open the mind in ways logic alone cannot. Buddhism, with its rich tradition, offers countless parables and stories that illuminate the path to resolving family conflict. One such story is that of the Buddha and his own family, who struggled with misunderstandings and attachment like any other. The Buddha's life itself is a living example of how compassion and wisdom can heal even the most tangled bonds. Consider the parable of the two arrows. Imagine you are struck by an arrow, painful and sudden. That's the initial hurt from a family quarrel, a harsh word, or betrayal. But then, imagine being struck by a second arrow, your own reaction of anger, regret, or resentment. Buddhism teaches that while the first arrow is often unavoidable, the second is optional. This means that while hurt will happen, how we respond is within our power. Choosing compassion over anger, understanding over blame, transforms the experience. There's also the story of the burning house from the Lotus Sutra. A father tries desperately to save his children from a burning house, using skillful means, stories, and promises to coax them out to safety. This parable reminds us that sometimes, to resolve family conflicts, we must speak the language of the heart, using patience, creativity, and love to guide those we care about back to safety, back to peace. In everyday life, Buddhist teachers often share anecdotes about family struggles, moments when forgiveness broke down walls, or when a small act of kindness shifted a frozen relationship. These stories inspire us by showing that healing is possible, even in the most difficult circumstances. Through these teachings, we learn that conflict is not a curse, but an opportunity, a mirror reflecting our inner work. Each story carries a message that by cultivating awareness, letting go of ego, and embracing compassion, we can transform suffering into connection. So, when you face family challenges, remember these stories. Let them be reminders that you are not alone, that the wisdom of ages. One of Buddhism's most profound teachings is the truth of impermanence, that everything in life is in constant flux, ever-changing, never fixed. This includes our family relationships, with their joys and struggles, harmony and conflict. When tensions flare, it's easy to feel trapped, as if the pain will last forever. But embracing impermanence means recognizing that no feeling, no argument, no moment of hurt is permanent. Like clouds passing across the sky, emotions arise and fade. This awareness can bring immense relief and perspective. Impermanence encourages us to hold space for change, to understand that today's conflict is not the final chapter. It invites patience, reminding us that healing is a process, unfolding in its own time. Closely connected is the teaching of karma, the law of cause and effect. Every action, word, and thought we sow plants seeds that will grow in the future. Family conflicts don't arise randomly. They are the fruits of past actions, both seen and unseen. This understanding empowers us to take responsibility, not blame, for how we contribute to the situation. Karma isn't about punishment or fate. It's about mindful creation. We have the power to sow seeds of kindness, patience, and forgiveness, which will blossom into harmony and peace. When we see family conflicts through this lens, they transform from painful obstacles into fertile ground for growth. Each disagreement becomes a chance to practice letting go, to cultivate virtues, and to deepen our spiritual journey. Imagine viewing every clash not as a defeat, but as an invitation to awaken wisdom, to practice compassion, and to build resilience. This perspective doesn't erase the pain, but it softens its grip, allowing us to respond with clarity and grace. Embracing impermanence and karma teaches us that change is possible, and that the healing we seek begins with each mindful moment, each conscious choice. Through this, family life is a journey, a beautiful, complex, and sometimes challenging journey. Conflicts may arise like storms, but Buddhism offers us a map, a set of tools, and a way of being that help us navigate through these storms toward calm and understanding. Throughout our exploration, we've uncovered core Buddhist teachings, compassion, loving kindness, patience, and mindfulness, that invite us to soften our hearts and open our minds. We've seen how practical techniques like meditation, deep listening, and empathetic communication transform tension into connection. Stories and parables reminded us that conflict is not a curse, but a teacher, that each challenge carries within it a seed of growth. And by embracing impermanence and karma, we learn to see change as natural and to take responsibility for our actions, planting the seeds of peace one moment at a time. But wisdom is not enough if it remains abstract. The real transformation happens when we bring these teachings into daily life, in the small gestures, the difficult conversations, the moments when patience is tested and kindness is needed most. Imagine greeting each family interaction as an opportunity to practice presence, to truly see, hear, and honor one another. Imagine responding to frustration with calm, to anger with compassion, and to misunderstanding with curiosity. This path isn't easy, nor is it perfect. There will be setbacks and moments of doubt, but the heart of Buddhist practice is perseverance, returning again and again to mindfulness, kindness, and love. As we walk this path, we realize that family conflict isn't something to fear or avoid. It's a mirror reflecting our own growth, a catalyst for deeper connection and understanding. So let us embrace these teachings with courage and openness, weaving Buddhist wisdom into the fabric of our family lives. In doing so, we create not just peaceful homes, but a legacy of harmony, compassion, and enduring love that ripples far beyond our walls.